Montana Territory. Early spring of 1872. The wind came down from the mountains sharp with snow, but Gideon Shaw spotted the girl before the storm hit. He was riding fence along the north pasture, a coil of wire slung over his saddle horn, when he saw the figure stumbling through the sage. She moved like someone who had not eaten in days, wrapped in a torn dress that clung to her back like wet paper. Blood stained the fabric, dark and dried. Gideon dismounted fast. "Miss," he called, stepping toward her. "You hurt." She flinched hard at his voice, arms coming up like she expected a blow. He stopped right there, hands raised. "I ain't gonna touch you," he said, voice steady, "but you look about ready to fall over." Her knees gave out anyway. Gideon caught her before she hit the dirt. She was light, too light, and her skin burned with fever. He scooped her up, careful of her back, and carried her to his horse. "You're all right now," he said, more to her than himself. "You'll never see a strap again, not while I'm breathing." Her name was Zinnia Louden. He learned that later, after the fever broke. She was 20 and had come west with her uncle's family from Missouri. The uncle had taken to drinking and worse. He whipped her for speaking out of turn, for looking sideways, for no reason at all. 3 nights ago, she'd run. Gideon had cleaned her wounds, jaw tight as he peeled away the dress that had fused to her skin. He said nothing, just worked by lamplight, hands steady with salve and linen. He had seen a lot in war, but nothing that twisted his gut like the sight of that girl's back. Now she lay in his spare room, tucked beneath a wool quilt, hair brushed out and face pale but calm. She opened her eyes that third morning. "You didn't touch me while I was asleep." "No, ma'am," he said quietly from the doorway, hat in his hands. Her throat worked. "You could have." "I would never." Zinnia looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded like she believed him. Gideon's place sat in a wide valley a day's ride from Fort Benton. He had 100 head of cattle, a barn that leaned left in windstorms, and a dog named Solace who never barked. It had been years since he let anyone stay under his roof. But Zinnia did not take up much space. She helped where she could, quietly folding laundry, sweeping out the porch, even boiling coffee, though her hands still trembled. She never asked for anything. One afternoon he came in from the field to find her feeding Sela's scraps from her own plate. "You're too kind to that mutt," he said, setting down his gloves. Zinnia looked up, her mouth twitching. "He listens better than most men." Gideon barked a laugh. "That he does." It was the first time she joked. He caught her smiling when she thought he was not looking. A week passed. Then 2. Zinnia started walking stronger. Her back healed in patches, though scars still marked her skin. One morning he found her in the barn, brushing down his mare. "You should not be lifting that arm yet," he said, stepping into the stall. "I am fine," she murmured, not looking up. "I like her. She does not startle when I move fast." Gideon nodded. "Neither do I, for the record." She turned then. Her eyes met his, steady as a rifle barrel. "I know," she said softly. He felt something shift in his chest. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the sun drop behind the hills, she said, "Why did you help me?" Gideon did not answer right away. He glanced out at the pasture where the grass shimmered gold. "I rode with the 5th during the war," he said quietly. "Saw too many men take what they wanted just because they could. I swore if I ever had a choice, I'd be on the other side of that." Zinnia looked down at her hands. "You chose right." He turned to her. "You ever want to leave, I'll help you go, but if you stay, no one will raise a hand to you here, not ever." She reached out slowly, fingers brushing his. "I do not want to leave." Days grew warmer. Snow melted from the ridgeline. Zinnia began humming while she worked. Sometimes Gideon would glance up from his ledger to find her standing in the doorway, hair braided over one shoulder, soft smile on her face. He started waking easier, sleeping deeper. One morning, she brought him coffee in bed. "You spoil me," he muttered, sitting up. "I just like seeing you without that hat on," she said, teasing. He reached out and caught her hand. "Zinnia," she froze. "I know I am not much for words," he said, voice low, "but I think about you more than I should." Her breath hitched. "I think about you too," she whispered. Gideon leaned forward, brushing her cheek with his thumb. "Then let me court you proper," he said. "No rush, I just want to do it right." Zinnia's eyes filled with tears. "You already are." That night he kissed her under the stars. She touched his face like it was something precious. And for the first time in years, Gideon Shaw believed that maybe the world could be kind again. The lambing started early that year. Snow still clung to the shady banks of the creek, but the ewes dropped their young scattered along the bottom field. Gideon was up before the sun, pulling on boots stiff with frost. Zinnia had taken to rising when he did, lighting the stove and frying salt pork with cornmeal until the smell filled the cabin. She didn't ask to help, not directly, but one morning she followed him out, her shawl pinned close and her braid tucked beneath a scarf. "If I'm in the way, you can say so," she said, eyes narrowed against the wind. "There's a birthing pen needs cleaning," he said, gesturing with his chin. "If you've got the stomach for it." She didn't flinch. "Lead the way." By noon, her skirts were mudded to the knee and she was elbow-deep in straw, pulling a weak lamb to its feet. Gideon watched from the fence rail, hands quiet around his flask. He didn't interrupt her, didn't offer correction. She worked like someone trying to prove something only to herself. That night, she came in with straw in her hair and a flush in her cheeks. She stood by the fire, hands outstretched, and said, "That little one with the black ears, he's not going to make it, is he?" He shook his head slowly. "Sometimes they don't, even when you do everything right." Her mouth pressed into a line, but she didn't look away from the flames. "I hate that." He crossed the room and handed her a cup. "I do too." Zinnia didn't cry, but her eyes stayed soft the rest of the evening. The following week, a letter arrived by courier from Gideon's sister in Miles City. He opened it at the kitchen table, brows lifting as he read. When he looked up, Zinnia was setting a jar of preserves on the shelf. "Emmeline and her husband are passing through on their way to Butt," he said. "She asked if they can stay a night here." Zinnia folded her hands. "Will she mind me being here? She'll be glad to see I'm not living like a hermit anymore." He paused. "You don't have to explain anything to her or anyone. I'm not ashamed," she said simply. "I just don't want to be pitied." He nodded once. "You won't be." The day they arrived, the house smelled of biscuits and roast onions. Zinnia had cleaned until the windows shone, and she wore a dusky blue dress Gideon had brought back from town, still stiff at the seams. Emmeline was tall and brisk, with gray eyes like her brother's. She embraced him at the door, then turned to Zinnia with a curious smile. "I'm Emmeline," she said, offering her hand, "and you must be the reason Gideon's letters stopped sounding so lonely." Zinnia flushed but didn't drop her gaze. "I'm helping with the lambing." "Well, bless you for that," Emmeline said, stepping inside. "He's always been better with horses than people." That evening, Zinnia sat beside Gideon on the porch while the stars came out, her fingers wrapped around a tin cup. "Your sister's kind," she said. "I didn't expect that. She's plain-spoken," he replied, "but she's never cruel." Zinnia leaned her head against his shoulder for the first time, quiet, like the trust had crept up on her without asking permission. "I still wake up sometimes," she said after a while, "thinking I'm back there. That I'll hear his boots outside the door." Gideon didn't speak. He just reached over and took her hand, his thumb brushing the knuckles with soft, steady pressure. "I'm not scared anymore," she added, "but it still finds me in the dark." "Then we'll keep a lamp burning," he said. "Every night if you need it." She didn't answer right away, but her grip didn't loosen. By the time the moon had cleared the ridge, her breathing had gone even and slow. He stayed there with her until the night turned cold and the porch boards creaked beneath them like an old lullaby. The calves were weaned by the time wild asters started blooming along the creek. Gideon had spent the better part of the week mending the eastern fence line, and when he came back late one afternoon, his shirt damp with sweat and his boots caked with dry mud, he found Zinnia sitting cross-legged on the porch floor, mending a bridle strap with a curved needle and a spool of wax thread. "You take to leatherwork now?" he asked, hitching a brow as he stepped up beside her. She didn't look up. "I asked a Maline how to fix the stitching. Figured it was better than waiting for you to get around to it." He eased down beside her, stretching his legs out with a quiet grunt. "You always this handy?" "No," she said, tugging the thread tight. "But I'm learning to be." He watched her fingers work, careful and sure. When she tied off the last knot, she set the bridle aside and turned toward him, knees drawn up beneath her skirt. "You ever think about leaving here?" she asked. He leaned back on his hands. "You mean selling off the stock and heading east?" "No, I mean if you ever wanted something different, more than cattle and fence posts." He took a long breath before answering. "I thought about it once, after the war. But I couldn't stomach the crowds or the noise. This land's the only place I ever felt like I belonged." She nodded, brushing a stray hair from her cheek. "I think I could belong here too. You already do." She looked at him then, and the air between them shifted, heavy with something unspoken. That evening, while Gideon loaded the last bale into the loft, Zinnia stood in the doorway of the barn, her arms wrapped around her middle. "Do you ever miss having a family?" she asked quietly. He paused on the ladder, one boot still on the rung. "I miss what it could have been. Not what it was. My folks died before I was grown," she said. "I always thought once I married it'd be different, that I'd build something better." He climbed down, dusting straw from his sleeves. "You still can." She looked up, uncertain. Even after everything, he stepped closer. "Especially after everything." Zinnia's eyes didn't leave his. "I don't know how to start again." "You don't have to know," he said gently. "You just have to want to." Later, they stood in the back pasture, watching the dusk settle over the hills. The wind moved the grass in slow waves, and the horses stood quietly near the fence, their heads low. "Sometimes," she said, not looking at him, "I feel like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like it's too good to stay this way. I used to feel that way too. What changed? You did." She turned to face him, her expression open in a way he hadn't seen before. "I never thought I'd be safe enough to want anything again. You are. And you can." Zinnia reached for his hand, her grip warm and steady. "I want this, this place." He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "Then it's yours." In the quiet that followed, neither of them needed to say more. The mountains stood dark against the sky, the stars coming out one by one, and the world settled around them like it had been waiting for this all along. The first real rain of the season came down hard, flattening the grass and turning the back lane to muck. Gideon returned from the far ridge soaked to the bone, his coat heavy with water and his hat dripping. Zinnia met him at the barn, lantern in hand, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "You're late," she said, stepping back as he led the gelding inside. "I was starting to worry. Had to pull a yearling out of the creek," he said, voice graveled from the cold. "Fool thing slid down the embankment and got itself wedged between two rocks." She set the lantern on a hook and reached for a dry burlap sack. "You should have come back for help," I managed. Zinnia handed him the sack, eyes narrowing. "You always say that." He ran the cloth over his arms, then paused. "You saying I ought to learn to ask? I'm saying if you don't, you'll wear yourself down before summer." She tilted her head. "You take care of everything but yourself." He folded the cloth and set it aside. That's something you're planning to change. I already have, she said, stepping closer. You just haven't noticed. Her hands went to his shirt buttons, undoing them slowly, her knuckles brushing his chest. She didn't speak again until his shirt was peeled away and tossed over a stall rail. You're burning up, she murmured, touching his brow. I'll be fine. Zinnia shook her head. You always say that, too. He caught her wrist gently. You fuss over me more than I deserve. I don't fuss, she said. I look after what matters. They stood there a moment, the sound of rain pattering against the tin roof. Then she tipped her head up and kissed him, not hurried or shy, but sure. You matter, she whispered. That night, Gideon let her pull him close in bed, her hands resting against his ribs, her breath warm at his neck. Neither of them spoke, but the silence between them had changed, no longer the hush of caution, but the quiet knowing of two people who no longer had to guard themselves. By morning the rain had cleared, leaving the field slick and shining. The valley smelled of wet earth and sweet pine. Zinnia stood barefoot on the porch, watching the mist rise off the pasture. Her hair hung loose, catching the breeze. Gideon stepped out beside her, nursing a tin mug of chicory brew. He didn't speak right away, just stood beside her, watching the light shift across the hills. I sent a wire to the circuit judge, he said after a while. Ask him to come out next month. Zinnia turned to him. Why? I want us married proper. No fuss, no crowd, just you, me, and the man with the book. She didn't answer right away. Then she reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. That's all I ever wanted. They spent the rest of the morning clearing the flooded troughs and checking the fence posts along the south slope. Zinnia rode bareback on the old dun mare, her skirts hitched and her legs streaked with mud. Gideon watched her move ahead of him, steady and sure, and something eased in his chest he hadn't realized was still tight. Near the cottonwoods, she reined in and waited. When he reached her, she nodded toward a patch of low ground where the grass grew thick and tall. We should plant something there, she said. Maybe squash or beans. You planning to stay through harvest then? I'm not going anywhere. He leaned forward in the saddle and kissed her, slow and sure, the taste of her lips sweeter than spring rain. They rode home beneath a sky split with sunlight, and when the wind came up, it carried no ghosts. Just the scent of new earth and the sound of two hearts finally at rest. The judge arrived the second Sunday of June, just as the wild roses peeked along the fence line. His wagon rattled down the lane with a mule team and a dust cloud trailing behind. Gideon met him at the gate, sleeves rolled and collar damp with sweat. Zinnia stood on the porch in a linen dress she'd sewn herself, the skirt hemmed with a row of tiny blue stitches. They wed beneath the cottonwood at the edge of the pasture, where the soil was soft and the light filtered down in gold. Gideon wore a clean shirt, and his boots polished with lard and ash. Zinnia had flowers in her braid, just wild yarrow and sage stems she'd picked that morning. She held his hands with a calm steadiness, her thumb brushing over the back of his as vows were spoken, and the judge's voice carried soft over the land. Afterward, they shared bread and beans with the judge at the table, and Zinnia poured coffee into enamel cups while the wind stirred the curtain lace. No one made a speech. There was no music, just the creak of the rafters and a quiet peace that filled the room like light through the window panes. That night, Gideon sat on the porch step, whittling a block of pine down to a smooth curve. Zinnia came out with a quilt over her shoulders and sat beside him without speaking. The stars were thick above the ridge, the moon pale behind a veil of clouds. I never imagined it would feel like this, she said after a time. Like what? Like I haven't lost anything. He set the carving aside and turned toward her. You haven't, not really. I thought I'd always carry it, the fear, the watching. But I don't feel hollow anymore. "You're not," he said. "You're whole." Zinnia leaned into him, her head against his chest. "I didn't think I'd have a home again." "You built one," he said, wrapping his arm around her. By midsummer, the garden she'd planted near the creek grew thick with squash vines and pole beans curling around cedar stakes. She spent mornings barefoot in the dirt, humming tunelessly while she weeded. Gideon had added a second stall to the barn and hung a new gate on the south end. When he came in for dinner, she'd meet him with a damp cloth and a cup of water steeped with mint. One evening, he found her standing at the edge of the field, looking out over the grass with her arms crossed. "There's something I've been thinking," she said when he came up beside her. "All right. I'd like to teach. Not in a schoolhouse, just here. There's families down the valley with children who haven't had letters or numbers put to them. You want to teach them here, in the barn, maybe, or under the cottonwood, just one or two at a time," he nodded. "You want me to build you a bench, too?" He kissed her temple. "Done." They cleared space near the porch, and Gideon built the benches from leftover fence posts and fir planks, sanding the edges smooth. Zinnia stitched cushions from old flour sacks and dyed them with walnut bark until they turned a soft brown. The first child showed up a week later, a girl with missing teeth and a slate board under her arm. By the end of the month there were 5, and Zinnia kept a tin of chalk and a stack of readers by the hearth. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned to fire, she'd lean against the doorway while Gideon lit the lanterns. He'd glance up from the ledgers or the saddle work and meet her gaze across the room. One night, she laid a small wooden box in his lap, wrapped in a strip of homespun. Inside was a carved bird, its wings tucked close and its beak just open. "You whittled the shape," she said, "but I sanded it. Finish the edges." He ran his fingers over the bird's back. "We made it together," Zinnia smiled. "Like everything else." Years passed in layers. The seasons turned and returned again, frost on the fence posts, spring melt through the gullies, summers thick with heat and cicadas. They built a smokehouse, added a second room to the cabin, and watched the cottonwood grow tall enough to shade half the pasture. Children came and went with their slates and their readers, and Zinnia taught them to write names and read stories aloud. Gideon took on fewer cattle, kept the herd lean and manageable. He carved more birds in the winter, and she lined them up along the mantel, each one different. One morning, she came in from the garden with mud on her skirts and a bunch of wild onions in her apron. "There's a woman coming from Fort Benton next week," she said. "She wants to learn her letters." He looked up from his coffee. "Does she know it's not a schoolhouse?" She said, "It don't matter, only that I'm kind and I don't make folks feel small." He set down the mug. "You never have." Zinnia pressed her hand to his cheek. "That's why I stayed." Their hair grayed slow and soft, and the porch wood weathered under their steps. The fire never went out, not even in the worst storms. And every night, without fail, Gideon wrapped an arm around Zinnia's waist before they drifted into sleep, her head tucked beneath his chin, his breath steady beside hers. The land changed, but they never did, not in the ways that counted. They stayed together, quiet and strong, like the roots of the cottonwood they married beneath. And in the hush of each evening, long after the world had turned, they still looked at each other like it was the first time.